So, tonight I wanted to talk about why free speech requires nationalism. Now, a lot of people who are attracted to free speech come from a kind of internationalist slash anarchist libertarian strain of thought that holds that markets are ideal means of distributing things, whether that's wealth or ideas or truth. If you follow Jonathan Rauch's liberal science doctrine that he advances in Kindly Inquisitors, a book every libertarian should read, in my opinion. But the truth is that freedom of speech requires nationalism. And for most people who come from a advocacy for free speech background, that may sound a little counterintuitive. They think the freedom of speech is a universal thing. And there's a few points of concession to make with leftists here. One of the arguments people will try to make in defending free speech is saying that speech is subjective, and more importantly, the interpretation of the content of speech is subjective. What's offensive to one person is not going to be offensive to another. So how can you make an objective law that will determine what a certain speech means? We've discussed this on this channel before in terms of, is George Orwell's 1984 an advocacy for totalitarianism, or is it opposition to totalitarianism? It's just kind of a subtle distinction. It's a more difficult question than it at first appears, because there's nothing in 1984 that is explicitly advocating for or against anything. It's just a depiction of a scenario, and it is left to the reader to decide, well, this is very undesirable. And so it's interpreted as opposition, but there's no necessary reason why that should be the case. The interpretation is subjective. So let me inject a little bit of more serious philosophy into this. Back in the middle of, I want to say I can look this up actually. The middle of the 20th century, an English philosopher named John Austin wrote a book called How to Do Things with Words. And the argument he makes there is that, words can be actions, essentially. And so one of the other, for example, when a priest is officiating a wedding and he says, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," to the bride and the groom, that's not a description, nor is it a command, nor is it expressing an idea. What he is doing when he says that sentence, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," it is an action. It's a legal action, in fact. And in a similar vein, when a judge makes a pronouncement, "I pronounce you guilty," or "I pronounce you not guilty," it's a legal. It's essentially committing an action with words. And when we make promises to each other, those are proxies for action. There are promises for an action. It's a contract, you could say. And contracts are other forms of actions done with words. So the other argument that people will try to make in defense of freedom of speech by saying, well, speech isn't action, that's just not true much of the time. Sometimes it's true, oftentimes it's not. And the subjective point is the thing I want to focus on here. The point about doing things with words, and words actually being actions sometimes, indeed much of the time, is sort of a peripheral thing to put a flag in and remember when people try to make a distinction, say, speech is not action, is never true. It's not true. Speech can be action. But the point about subjectivity is where nationalism becomes critical if we want to preserve the thing that we're talking about when we refer to freedom of speech. And what is that exactly? I think what we're fundamentally talking about when we're talking about the freedom of speech is the freedom of inquiry. And there's a lot of bad arguments that try to establish where the limits are with speech. When they're saying, oh, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. It's a terrible example. One of the worst things Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, an otherwise pretty decent judge, did, and he didn't come up with it himself, incidentally. If those of you who've read In Defense of Hatred will know that from the introduction. But, John Stuart Mill's example was, an incitement to violence against a wealthy homeowner who's got grain stores in the midst of a famine, where you have the standard that Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes was trying to establish with his Fire in a Crowded Theater case, the clear and present danger, is more or less what John Stuart Mill was trying to go for. But the critical thing is not what is being done, I think, but what is not being done. And this is not a legal point. It's more of an experiential point. What is it that we're trying to protect when we establish these protections for freedom of speech? I mean, it's not just the freedom to call people names, to call people offensive euphemisms or whatever. That's a nice side effect. But the critical point is, in my opinion, freedom of inquiry and freedom of political and religious opinion and exploration, because you don't get the ability to explore new ideas if you aren't allowed to be wrong, and if you're not allowed to say things that are offensive. And so we just establish a blanket protection for speech in order to allow for positive evolution. And this is all contingent upon our speech being mutually understood by other people. But the problem is that the comprehensibility of our speech is dependent upon some shared assumptions, some shared semantic understandings about what these meanings are. What does the word blue mean when I'm describing it to someone else? Is when I say the sentence, there is a green tree outside, there is no chance that an English-speaking person is going to misunderstand that sentence. There is a green tree outside the house. There might be some confusion about what kind of tree, what shade of green, how far away from the house, but the core of the message is crystalline. There's zero chance of misunderstanding that. Now, the extreme of what I'm about to refer to is people speaking different languages. I can't communicate that in Swahili, or German, or Korean, And the idea I want to introduce here is what's called the linguistic frame, wherein, to go back to that previous example, if the color green had a technical meaning that referred to something other than color, like green meant safe, for example, and I said, maybe I'm speaking to a number of arborists, and for them, a green tree as opposed to a yellow tree or a red tree, I'm making this up as I go, but so you can imagine them having some kind of like traffic light system of how dangerous is a particular tree to remove. They might interpret that as there's a particularly easy or safe tree, or maybe it refers to a different height. Green is the middle height, and black is a very short tree, and white's a very who knows. There are different shop talk and inside jokes and different sub-communities that develop shorthand organically to communicate with each other more efficiently will create different linguistic frames. Now, I've been speaking in a hypothetical off-the-cuff example as I go, which is maybe not the most helpful, but there's a more clear example I could give that comes from the realm of psychology. most people, when they hear the term negative reinforcement, will think of punishment of some kind. You might, if you have a shock collar on your dog, you might think, oh yeah, when my dog doesn't listen to me, I shock him. Negative reinforcement. And that's the generally understood meaning. If you ask most people, what's a simpler way of describing negative reinforcement, they'll say, oh, punishment. It's doing something to someone in order to get them to change their behavior. It's, hit them or something like that. In the world of psychology, negative reinforcement has a more precise meaning, and it's not just different from punishment, but it's actually exclusive from punishment. Negative reinforcement, negative doesn't describe like pain or pleasure or good or bad. In the technical psychological language, positive means adding something and negative means removing something. So when you're talking with a behaviorist about negative reinforcement, what you're talking about is attempting to change or modify a behavior by removing a negative stimulus. An example, when I was in high school, the Associated Student Government, who were kind of dicks at the time, were doing a fundraising drive. And their strategy for raising money for whatever it was they were doing, I'm sure it was extremely important, was to play over the intercom an exceptionally annoying rendition of I Like to Move It, Move It. It had this annoying klaxon in the background. And they would play this song until someone came in and paid them money to make it stop. And when someone came and paid them money to make it stop, they removed the negative stimulus. That is negative reinforcement in the psychological sense of the word. Negative reinforcement as punishment and negative reinforcement as removing adverse stimulus are subtly different, but it's kind of important. And if two people, a psychologist and a non-psychologist, are talking with each other and they're using the phrase negative reinforcement, there's going to be some miscommunication. There's going to be some misunderstanding. Now, that's a fairly clear-cut example of the kind of the way that different linguistic frames can make communication more difficult. But these kinds of linguistic differences in linguistic frames are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. Think about acronyms and all the things that acronyms can stand for, just as an example. And so what happens is when you get different linguistic frames from different communities trying to speak across to each other, freedom of speech will actually lose its value. And the dangers of miscommunication and the distrust and the conflict that can arise from that confusion and misunderstanding are going to be greater than the value that free speech would bring, which approaches zero as the gaps between these linguistic frames becomes greater. Now, because of the nature of communities and the way that we require lots of different jobs to be done, we have men and women, we have people of different ages, and these people will engage in different jobs that need to be done. We need people to grow food, and we need people to weld things, and we need people to manage money, and so on and so forth. And all these different trades and groups will develop their own little vernaculars. Some degree of, separation and diversity in linguistic frames is going to be inevitable. And that by itself doesn't mean that freedom of speech has to go away or loses its value. But when the diversity becomes great enough, you will eventually cross a threshold where the possibility of mutual understanding becomes, essentially impossible. And against the hypothetical possibility of mutual comprehensibility, actually, before I go to that, let me make this a little bit more concrete. It's become accepted now in academic collegiate circles, a doctrine known as microaggressions. And in this way, if I tell a black friend of mine, you're very articulate, that can be taken as a kind of insult, as a kind of general statement about the inarticulate nature of black people as a group. Total nonsense, right? It's insane, and it's delusional, and it's paranoid, but it's not unpredictable delusion. It's not unforeseeable paranoia. Because when you have enough difference in communication style and enough misunderstanding between whites as a group and blacks as a group, for example, or psychologists and non-psychologists as a group, equally valid in the aftermath of the APA's recent report on masculinity, it's natural for these groups to distrust each other and even to assume maybe not so benign motives and intent and meaning in what each other is saying. So, a black person telling another black person, wow, that was very articulate, Mr. Dyson, or a white person telling another white person, wow, that was very articulate, very well said. There would be no malice read there, maybe. But when you cross that barrier, even if the speech is benign and mutually understood, in that case, the more general distrust and misunderstanding that arises from differences in culture and background and maybe root language. Some people talk about the inner city black vernacular as almost becoming its own language or pidgin, as the linguists talk about the term. And so at the end of the day, freedom of speech, if it is to be legitimate and respected, requires nationalism. It requires a common language, a common people, a nation with a shared identity in order for freedom of speech to be viable. Because without nationalism, the linguistic frames are going to be too varied, and the value of free speech is going to be lost in distrust and misunderstanding, even within a shared language. And so I don't actually know if America would qualify as a nation in this regard. America might be too big. I don't know. But I know that larger than a nation is definitely a no-go. And we can see that in the European Union, where comments about certain religions are becoming verboten. And why shouldn't they? If speech is subjective, after all, and it functionally is when you have enough linguistic frames that you're trying to operate across, then what's the value of preserving freedom of speech if the value is subjective? That means the value is not really anything concrete, nothing solid, nothing necessary. Whereas the harm and the distrust that certain kinds of speech demonstrably and self-evidently lead to, everyone knows that. Everyone knows not to talk politics and religion at the dinner table, don't they? Best not allow that. So, if you have enough diversity in these linguistic frames, then freedom of speech loses its viability, and you're going to get censorship. First, of certain kinds of phrases, then on certain subjects entirely. Just don't talk politics and religion, they might say. And sexuality might come after that. Who knows? But at the end of the day, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the arguments for freedom of speech, again, I can't recommend it enough. You owe it to yourself and to your country to go and listen to Christopher Hitchens' magnificent defense of free speech and of hate speech at Hart House University in 2006. I'll be sure to leave a link in the description here. As magnificent as these defenses of free speech are. They simply don't apply if you don't have a nation, if you don't have some semblance of common identity and commonality that gives you enough of a linguistic frame for there to be mutual comprehensibility. Because without that mutual comprehensibility and some degree of trust, there's no point to freedom of speech.